I reckon it was the cold that woke me most mornings on the trail, the kind that creeps into old bones even when I was young and didn't know it yet. That morning, I remember the sky was just beginning to soften from black to deep blue, a sliver of dawn light easing over the prairie. The ashes of last night's fire still whispered warmth, and I could smell the faint tang of smoke that had settled into my blanket and clothes, a scent I came to love, for it meant we were still moving, still alive, still pressing west. I stretched slow, every joint popping, and sat up on the hard ground. Frost clung to the grass, and the oxen lowed in the half-dark, shifting heavy bodies, eager for feed. I could hear one of the women, Mrs. Carter, already stirring, coughing softly as she shook out a pot to ready for coffee. Coffee was more precious than gold out there, and a single pot could feel like a promise that the day might be gentle. We kept quiet in those first minutes, each of us alone with the cold and the dawn. I pulled on my boots, still damp from yesterday's river spray, and stamped the stiffness from my feet, looking around at the other wagons spread like sleepy turtles across the plain. Smoke began to curl up in thin fingers from other camps as folks roused themselves, children's soft voices breaking the hush, asking for warmth, for bread, for their mothers. I would take my tin cup and stand near the fire, wrapping my hands around it while the coffee bubbled. Sometimes I'd catch the scent of bacon if someone was lucky enough to still have some, the fat hissing as it hit the pan. It made you thankful for small things, a warm swallow of coffee, the color rising in the sky, the sound of horses snorting softly as they shook off the night. It was there. In that quiet, I often found myself remembering why I was out here, why I chose the trail over the comfort of a settled life. I was young enough then to believe in the promise of the West, of land and sky so big it could swallow your past and let you start again. But even then, before the day's dust rose and the sun climbed high, I felt the weight of what it cost, the way the cold pressed into your bones and the hard ground reminded you that each mile came with a price. We didn't talk much as we packed up. Bedrolls were rolled tight and strapped down, pots banged softly as they were tucked away, and wheels were checked, spokes tapped and tightened. The oxen were harnessed, their breath steaming in the cold, and the wagons creaked as they shifted, ready to move again. I saddled my horse, an old sorrel with a white blaze, and ran a hand down her neck, feeling her warmth, grateful for her steady presence. And when the sun finally broke over the horizon, a thin line of gold cutting across the prairie, we were ready, lined up like a small army of dreams and desperation, waiting for the signal to move. I remember looking back at the empty patch of grass where my bed had been, a frost outline left behind, and thinking how that small shape was all a man needed to claim as his own. Then we moved, the first creak of wagon wheels breaking the dawn, the crunch of hooves in the frost, the slow beginning of another day that would be like so many others, yet somehow different, each sunrise marking another chance to keep going west, to keep chasing that horizon that never seemed to get closer, but always called onward. Whether you were a grizzled drover or a child holding on to your mother's skirts, after the first sips of coffee warmed your belly, you knew it was time to move. The prairie morning was brief, that soft hush before the day took hold, and we made use of every minute. I remember how the tarps came off first, the heavy canvas folded and shaken free of dew, sometimes leaving your hands wet and cold. The women packed their kitchens, securing the flour and the precious tins of lard, every crumb and drop counted for, while the men rolled bedding and checked the axles, feeling for cracks that might break a wheel before day's end. Sometimes a wheel would need greasing, the thick animal fat smeared along the hubs with a rag that was stiff with old grease and dust. The smell of it mixed with the sharp morning air, the tang of iron and wood, sweat and frost. I would check the harnesses, running my hand along leather straps, looking for wear, for tears that could snap and send a wagon off balance. Children were not idle either, though they often worked with grumbling faces. They fetched water, gathered up stray bits of rope and tools, held lanterns while fathers tied down loads. One boy, Timmy Carter, was always at my heels, peppering me with questions about my horse, about whether I had ever seen an Indian, about where we were going next. I would ruffle his hair and tell him to fetch a bucket or bring a rope, and he would run off, eager to be of use. Once the wagons were packed, there was always a moment when the families would pause, standing by their wheels, hands resting on the wood, looking west. It was a moment of quiet before the day's noise, as if each of us was asking ourselves if we were ready to go on, to face whatever waited down the trail. Then the moment would pass, and the call would go out to line up, to move. The oxen would be prodded into place, their slow, plodding strength ready to pull the heavy wagons over ruts and rocks. The mules and horses shifted, the smell of them rising warm into the morning air, their bodies steaming where the sun touched them. I would mount my horse, adjusting my hat, taking the reins, and riding down the line to check on folks. "Morning, Mr. Davis," I'd call, and he would nod, adjusting the brim of his hat, his wife giving me a tired smile from the wagon seat. I'd tip my hat to the women, give a wave to the children, and sometimes exchange a quiet word with another drover about the trail ahead, whether the river was up or the road was clear. Then came the moment when the lead wagon would creak forward, the wheels groaning, the oxen pulling in their slow, steady rhythm, and the whole line would begin to move, a small caravan of dreams and desperation, heading west once more. The sound of it was like a waking giant, the rumble of wheels, the slap of leather, the low calls of the drovers, the cries of the children as they settled in for the day's ride. And so we left behind another patch of prairie, the grass pressed flat where we had slept, the ashes of our fires scattering in the wind. The sun would be up now, bright and clear, promising a hard but honest day ahead, and the trail would stretch out before us, rutted and dusty, leading us toward that horizon that always stayed just out of reach. The moment the lead wagon began to roll forward, a low rumble spread through the camp like a waking beast. The wooden wheels creaked and groaned against the hard-packed earth, the oxen pulling with a slow, steady strength that never seemed to falter. I nudged my sorrel forward, the familiar jingle of my saddle and the soft thud of hooves on dirt filling the quiet morning. Dust rose in thin, lazy clouds behind the caravan, drifting up toward the clear blue sky and settling over the grasses and shrubs that lined the trail. The wind picked up, carrying the mingled smells of leather, sweat, and earth, along with the faint scent of sagebrush and wildflowers that bloomed in patches. It was a smell I came to know as the scent of the trail itself. As we moved, the children clung to their families or scampered alongside the wagons, their laughter cutting through the steady creaking of wheels. I glanced back at young Timmy Carter, grinning as he raced his sister along the ruts, their bare feet kicking up puffs of dust. That kind of joy was rare out here, but it made the long days a little lighter to bear. I often took these moments to listen to the rhythm of the trail, the soft calls of the drovers, the murmur of voices carried on the breeze. Folks would hum old tunes or tell stories as we walked, the music weaving itself into the soundscape of the day. Sometimes I'd join in, my rough voice adding to the chorus, if only to chase away the loneliness that could creep up when you'd been riding for hours. The land stretched wide and open, endless prairie under the great dome of the sky. On days like this, you could see forever, rolling hills, distant ridges, and the shimmering heat haze that blurred the horizon. It was a breathtaking sight, but it also reminded you how small you were in the grand scheme of things. A man could lose himself out here, forget his name and what he'd come for. I kept my eyes sharp, too. The trail was long and full of surprises. Sometimes you'd spot a herd of buffalo grazing far off to the side, their dark shapes moving slowly against the grass. Other times, you'd catch the flash of a hawk circling overhead, or hear the sudden crack of a twig as a deer bounded through the brush. The trail wasn't always kind either. The ground could shift from hard-packed clay to sticky mud without warning, and every mile meant watching for hidden rocks, deep ruts, and sudden dips that could throw a wagon off course. I'd ride ahead when I could, scouting the way and signaling back if there was trouble, feeling the wind in my face and the sun on my back. I remember one stretch that day where the road wound along a ridge, the land dropping away sharply on either side. The oxen hesitated, their hooves slipping on loose stones, and I had to coax them carefully, whispering soft words and nudging with my heels. The weight of those wagons was no small thing, and one wrong move could send a load tumbling down the slope. By midday, the sun climbed high, beating down with a dry heat that made the dust dance in the light. We slowed then, taking breaks when we could. Water was hauled from a small spring nearby, and folks stretched aching legs while the animals grazed. I remember sitting on a fallen log, chewing on a piece of tough biscuit and wiping the sweat from my brow, grateful for the shade of a lone cottonwood tree. The trail demanded patience and grit. Each day was a test, a slow and steady march toward a future none of us could see clearly. But as I looked around at the faces of my fellow travelers, some weary, some hopeful, I knew we carried more than just supplies in those wagons. We carried dreams, memories, and the stubborn will to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. Well now, crossing that river was one of the trickiest parts of the whole journey. I can still feel the cold river water biting at my boots and hear the roar of the current rattling in my bones. It wasn't no gentle creek or lazy stream. This river was wide and wild, a beast that had swallowed many a wagon before us. We reached the bank late in the afternoon, the sun hanging low but still strong enough to glint off the water's churning surface. The men gathered, sizing up the crossing, eyes narrowed and jaws tight with the weight of the task. There was no room for mistakes here. One wrong step or a snapped rope, and the river would claim our wagons, supplies, maybe even a life or two. The oxen stamped nervously, snorting steam in the cool air, muscles tensed like coiled springs. They'd pulled us for weeks, and they knew this was no ordinary stretch of dirt and rock. I gave my old friend, Big John, one of the lead oxen, a gentle pat on the neck, whispering a few words of encouragement. You had to speak kindly to animals when the road got tough. Our lead wagon rolled forward first, wheels crunching on the rocky shore. I was out there with the others, waist deep in the river, gripping a thick rope tied tight around the wagon's frame. The current tugged hard, pulling at our boots and making each step a battle. The water was colder than any winter I'd known, stabbing at my skin like 1,000 tiny knives. The riverbed was slick with moss and hidden stones, and more than once I nearly lost my footing. Each footfall had to be deliberate, careful, lest we topple or let the wagon slip. Behind me, the oxen strained against their yokes, their broad shoulders trembling under the weight. The wagon lurched, its wheels catching on a submerged log, and for a moment, time slowed. I could hear the gasps from the bank, the sharp commands barked by the wagon boss, the grunts from the oxen as they pushed with all their might. We pulled on the ropes, steadying the wagon, coaxing it forward inch by inch. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon crested the far bank with a heavy thud, safe for the moment. Cheers erupted from those waiting on the shore, but there was no time to rest. One by one, the rest of the caravan began their crossing, each wagon its own small battle against the river's relentless power. I'll never forget how the water swallowed a wheel from old Jenkins' wagon. It snapped loose in the current and went tumbling downstream. Jenkins swore like a thunderstorm, but with some quick thinking and a good long pole, we managed to fish it out. That wheel was the difference between making it through or being stranded. The children huddled on the bank, eyes wide and faces pale as they watched us wrestle with the river. Mothers clutched their little ones tight, whispering prayers to whatever higher power they believed in. Even the toughest men held their breath, knowing well the dangers lurking beneath the swirling waters. By the time the last wagon cleared the crossing, the sun had dipped behind the hills and the sky was painted with the colors of dusk. We stood there, soaking wet, muscles aching, but victorious. That river had tested us, sure enough, but it hadn't broken us. Later, as I sat by the fire and warmed my frozen hands, I thought about all the travelers who'd faced that same crossing. How many had been lost? How many dreams had drowned in those waters? The river was a reminder that the trail wasn't just about miles walked or wagons pulled. It was about respect. Respect for the land, for nature's power, and for the fragile thread by which our lives hung. Crossing that river bound us together tighter than any chain. It was a hard-earned victory, a story we'd tell for years to come, and a lesson in courage and grit that no man or woman could forget. The sun had barely climbed its highest peak when the heat started to press down on us like a heavy blanket, thick and unforgiving. Out on that wide stretch of dusty trail, there was nowhere to hide, no trees tall enough to cast a shadow, no breeze soft enough to bring relief. Just the endless sky above and the dry earth baking beneath our boots. We trudged along, the wheels of the wagons kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the air like a ghostly haze. The oxen moved slower now, their tongues hanging out, eyes drooping with exhaustion. I could see the sweat soaking into their hides, shining like wet leather in the relentless sunlight. The folks in the wagons fanned themselves with whatever scraps of cloth they had, hats, kerchiefs, even bits of cardboard. Some tried to nap in the shade of their canvas covers, but the heat made sleep a cruel tease, always slipping away. By noon, the sun blazed as bright as a fire, turning the landscape into a furnace. We stopped for a break by a patch of scrub brush that barely qualified as shade. Water barrels were opened and passed around, but the water was lukewarm and tasted like dust and regret. Still, it was a blessing. We drank deep, letting the liquid wash away some of the grit from our throats. I remember sitting there, wiping the sweat from my brow with a dirty sleeve, watching the sky shimmer in the heat. The mirage danced just beyond the horizon, like a promise that the day might end and the cool night would come soon. But we all knew that the long, hot afternoon was the true test of a trail driver's mettle. It wasn't the fast rides or the wild storms. It was the slow grind under the sun, with every muscle aching and every hope pinned on the next well or watering hole. The wagon boss paced along the line, shouting orders and checking the oxen. His face was red and blistered, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. I admired that man's grit. He never let the heat show him down. One of the younger men, a spry fella named Tom, tried to crack a joke to lighten the mood. "Hey, if this sun was any hotter, I'd swear we're sitting on the surface of the sun itself," he said, laughing despite the sweat pouring down his face. The others chuckled, though their smiles were weak, worn down by the day's toil. We passed a few prairie dogs darting in and out of their burrows, oblivious to the sweat and struggle all around them. Their high-pitched barks echoed across the flatland, a strange sort of music in the otherwise heavy silence. As the afternoon dragged on, I found myself thinking about the families riding with us, mothers fanning their babies, children too tired to play, old folks resting in the shade, holding on to their memories and dreams. This heat was an invisible enemy, sapping strength and will, but it never broke their spirits. I looked out over the line of wagons, each one a tiny world of its own, carrying hopes and fears, laughter and sorrow. And me, just an old cowboy trying to keep it all together, one step at a time. When the sun finally started its slow descent, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple, a cool breeze picked up, gentle like a soft whisper. The oxen lifted their heads, ears flicking at the change, and the folks brightened, knowing relief was near. That long, hot afternoon was a reminder that the trail wasn't just a journey across land. It was a journey of endurance, patience, and quiet courage. It was about facing the relentless sun and still finding the strength to move forward one dusty mile at a time. And as I sit here now, decades later, the memory of that day lingers, a testament to the spirit that carried us through beneath that endless sky. Now, Riding Point was no small job, and I was lucky to have had the chance to do it a few times along the trail. When you're riding point, you're the eyes and ears of the whole wagon train, the first to spot trouble, the first to see the good land ahead, and the first to face whatever might be lurking out yonder. That morning, I was up before the sun, the sky still heavy with darkness, the stars twinkling cold and clear. I saddled up Old Blue, my trusted horse, who'd carried me through thick and thin. There's a special bond between a man and his horse, especially when you're riding point, because you're out there alone or with just one or two other riders miles ahead of the wagons, carrying the weight of the whole journey on your shoulders. As we set out, the trail was quiet, except for the soft crunch of hooves on dirt and the occasional rustle of prairie grass. I kept my eyes sharp, scanning the horizon. The trail was long and dusty, twisting through open plains and patches of scrub, with the occasional stand of trees by creeks and rivers. The job was simple to say but hard to do. Watch for signs of danger. It could be a band of rustlers ready to make off with the wagons and all we carried. It could be wild animals, wolves, coyotes, or worse. Or it could be the land itself, rough and unforgiving, with hidden pitfalls and quicksand that might swallow a whole wagon if you weren't careful. I thought about the families riding behind me, tucked into their wagons, trusting me to keep them safe. It wasn't just a duty, it was a responsibility that settled deep into your bones. One wrong call, and it could mean disaster. There was a moment when the sun had just peeked over the hills, the morning light casting long shadows across the plains. I spotted movement near a cluster of bushes, a flicker of shapes that might have been deer, or maybe something less friendly. I signaled to the other rider with me, and we approached cautiously, weapons ready, but held steady. It turned out to be a small herd of pronghorn antelope, startled by our approach, but quick to dart away like ghosts. That little scare was a reminder that even out here, the land was alive and unpredictable. Riding Point meant being part of that wild world, feeling its pulse and respect its power. As the day wore on, I kept pace with the wagons behind, sending back signals when the trail ahead was clear or when we needed to slow down for rough patches. I spotted a promising spot for our next camp, a bend in a creek with tall cottonwoods providing shade and fresh water for the oxen. But Riding Point wasn't just about watchfulness. It was also about the solitude, the quiet moments when you could let your mind wander. I thought about my own journey, how far I'd come from the young man who first set foot on this trail, full of hope and fire. I thought about the people following me now, each with their own dreams and fears, making the hard choice to seek a better life out west. By the time the wagons caught up to me, the sun was hanging high and the day was well underway. I pulled Old Blue alongside the others, sharing a nod with the wagon boss. We'd made good time, and the trail was clear, for now. Riding Point taught me a lot about patience, vigilance, and trust. You learn to read the land, listen to the wind, and watch the sky for signs. But most of all, you learn that every mile forward is a mile closer to home, whatever home might mean for each of us. Now, if there's one thing I learned riding the Oregon Trail, it's that no matter how careful you are, trouble finds a way to show up when you least expect it. And out there on the open plains, a small setback can feel like the end of the world. Take that day, just like any other, we were making steady progress, the oxen plodding along, the wheels creaking, and the dust settling behind us. Then, all of a sudden, there came that sickening sound, a loud snap, and the sharp clatter of a broken wagon wheel hitting the hard ground. The whole train ground to a halt, folks scrambling out of their wagons with concerned looks. A broken wagon wheel out on the trail was no small thing. It could mean hours, maybe days, lost while you patched it up with whatever was on hand. Supplies were limited, and the nearest blacksmith might be hundreds of miles behind or ahead. We had to make do with grit, some nails, splints of wood, and a steady hand. I remember the wagon boss shaking his head as he sized up the damage, then barking out orders to the men to unload the wagon and get to work. Everyone pitched in, men, women, even the children doing their best to help. We scavenged for strong branches to use as splints, tied them with leather strips and rawhide. A few careful taps with a hammer, a bit of sweat, and by the afternoon the wheel was strong enough to get us back on the trail. But it wasn't just the wagons that gave us trouble. Midway through the day, one of the younger women took a bad step on a loose rock and twisted her ankle pretty bad. There were no doctors out here, no hospitals, just the knowledge passed down from old hands and the limited first aid supplies we carried. I sat with her for a spell, helping to wrap her ankle with strips of cloth soaked in cool water and calming her down as best I could. The pain was sharp, but she was tough, gritting her teeth through it. We fashioned a makeshift splint from a piece of wood and some rope so she could ride in one of the wagons instead of walking. Moments like that made you realize how fragile life could be on the trail. One wrong step, one snapped wheel, and your whole journey could slow to a crawl, maybe even come to a stop. But we didn't let those setbacks break our spirit. No, sir. We patched what we could, helped each other, and kept moving forward. Out here you learn that resilience is as important as strength, and sometimes more so. I remember looking around at the folks as we worked through those troubles. Faces grimy with dust, clothes worn thin, but eyes bright with determination. No matter the hardships, we were bound by a shared goal, a hope for a better life beyond the next ridge. And that hope, that promise of something new, was what kept the wheels turning and the oxen pulling, even when the trail was rough and the day long. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with streaks of gold and pink, there was a kind of magic that settled over the plains. The dust that had hung heavy all day started to drift gently, catching the last rays of sunlight like tiny flecks of fire. That evening, light always felt like a reward after a hard day's ride, a quiet moment to catch your breath and prepare for what lay ahead. We pulled the wagons off the trail, each one settling into its spot to form our familiar circle. It was a habit we'd all grown used to by then. The wagons came to rest in a loose ring. The oxen gathered in the middle, their tired bodies thankful for the rest and fresh water from the nearby creek. Camp was a bustle of activity, but there was a rhythm to it. The way a community that's been traveling together for weeks moves as one. Some of the men went about gathering firewood, stacking dry branches and kindling into neat piles. Others checked the wagons, tightening the ropes, inspecting the wheels and axles to make sure they'd hold for the next day's journey. Every little repair done then meant fewer troubles down the road. The women set about preparing the evening meal. The smell of coffee soon filled the air, bitter and strong, brewing over small fires next to pots, simmering with beans and whatever meat we had on hand. Food was simple out here: beans, hardtack, salted meat. But it was enough to keep the body going. And after a day like that, even the plainest meal tasted like a feast. Tending to the animals was another important task. Oxen and horses were given fresh water, and the tired beasts were brushed down and fed what hay or grass we could find nearby. These animals were the backbone of the whole operation, and without their strength, the journey would have been impossible. Watching them quietly resting reminded me of how much we relied on them, not just for hauling our wagons, but as steady companions through the wilderness. As the last light faded from the sky, we all gathered around the campfires, the flickering flames casting warm shadows on weathered faces. The chill of evening began to creep in, but the fire's heat chased it away, and the crackle of burning wood was a comfort after the silence of the day. Before settling in for the night, the wagon boss made his rounds, checking on everyone's gear and making sure the camp was secure. He was a man of few words, but you could tell he carried the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. I admired that about him. No matter what happened, he kept the train moving forward. With the animals fed and the wagons locked down, we took a few moments to sit quietly, watching the stars begin to prick the darkening sky. The vastness of the plains stretched out all around us, and it felt humbling to be just a small part of such an endless world. Evenings like that reminded me why we made this journey. The trail was long, dusty, and full of hardships, but it also offered moments of peace and beauty that stayed with you long after the fire died down. The colors of the sunset, the gentle murmur of the creek, the quiet companionship of those riding alongside you. These were the things that made the hard miles worthwhile. As the night settled in, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the land, for the people I'd traveled with, and for the chance to be part of something bigger than myself. The journey west wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about the stories we shared, the lessons we learned, and the memories we carried with us. When the sky grew dark and the stars began to sprinkle across the heavens like diamonds scattered on black velvet, we'd gather close around the campfire. That flickering glow brought us together after a day filled with dust and toil, and it was around those flames that the stories really came alive. The fire's warmth cut through the chill settling over the plains, and the crackling of wood was the soundtrack to our shared moments. Folks would pull their blankets tighter, lean in, and let their thoughts wander as the night deepened. It was a time to relax, to let the worries of the day fade just a bit. I'd sit there, watching the faces lit by firelight, some worn and tired, others bright with laughter. We told tales, tall and true, about the things we'd seen along the trail and the lives we left behind. Old-timers recounted the wild animals that had crossed their paths, the storms that rolled in like thunder gods, and the strange places where the earth seemed to change beneath their feet. The young ones, wide-eyed and curious, would listen closely, their imaginations painting pictures of the adventures we spoke of. There were stories of lost gold, mysterious disappearances, and daring escapes from angry rivers or rogue outlaws. Some were meant to teach a lesson, others just to pass the time and keep spirits high. Between the laughter and the quiet moments, there was also a lot of reflection. We spoke of why we had made this long, hard journey west, trading the comforts of home for the unknown. Some were chasing dreams of fertile land, hoping to carve out a new life with their own hands. Others were looking for freedom, away from debts, from laws, or from the past itself. I remember telling the young ones that this trail was more than just a path on a map. It was a journey of the heart. Every step forward was filled with hope, fear, and determination. You carried your family's dreams in your saddlebag, And every night by the fire you reminded yourself why you kept. There were moments when the laughter died down and silence took hold. Just the crackle of the fire and the vastness of the night sky. That silence made you think, made you feel small in the face of all this wilderness. But it also made you appreciate the bond between those sitting close, sharing warmth and stories in a world so wide and uncertain. Sometimes I'd share my own stories, memories from years past, when the trail was new to me and everything was a challenge. I talk about the people I met, the kind souls and the hard ones, the lessons learned the hard way. And as I spoke, I could see the flicker of understanding in their eyes, like the firelight passing from one heart to another. Those campfire nights were more than just rest. They were a reminder of why we made this journey. It wasn't just the land or the promise of riches. It was the hope for a better life, the chance to start fresh, and the stories we carry with us for the rest of our days. The trail was long and the road was rough, but around that fire we found something worth more than gold: connection, courage, and the strength to keep moving forward, no matter what the dawn might bring. As the camp settled into a quiet lull, the night stretched wide and deep above us, filled with stars so bright they seemed almost close enough to touch. Out there on the Oregon Trail, the night sky was a whole different world, clear and vast, untouched by city lights or the bustle of towns. It was the kind of night that made a man feel small, but also connected to something far bigger than himself. We took turns keeping watch while the rest of the camp slept. Night watch wasn't just a duty, it was a responsibility, a promise to look after the folks who trusted you with their lives. The trail could be unforgiving, and dangers often came in the dark. Prowling wolves, rattlesnakes, or worse, rustlers who might try to steal the oxen or supplies. I remember those hours under the stars, sometimes sitting alone by the dim glow of a small fire, listening to the soft sounds of the night. The breeze would whisper through the trees and grasses, carrying with it the faint calls of night creatures. The occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of leaves kept you alert, but never truly fearful. There was a kind of peace in those moments, too. The hard work and worries of the day faded, replaced by the vast stillness of the wilderness. It gave you time to think, to reflect on the journey so far and the road still ahead. I'd look up at the Milky Way arching overhead, reminding me how far from home we were and how much further we had yet to go. Sometimes I'd catch sight of other riders or wagons in the distance, their lanterns flickering like fireflies on the dark horizon. Knowing that others were out there on the same trail, sharing the same hopes and hardships, brought a quiet comfort. Night watch also meant keeping an eye on the animals. The oxen and horses were restless sometimes, unsettled by sounds or unfamiliar scents. You'd calm them with soft words and steady hands, making sure they didn't wander or panic. A frightened animal could cause more trouble than a rustler, especially when the wagons were packed tight. Between the watch and the stars, those nights were some of the most memorable parts of the journey. They taught you patience, vigilance, and respect for the land and its rhythms. And even in the darkest hours, there was always that glimmer of light, whether from the fire, the moon, or the countless stars above, that reminded us why we kept moving west. As dawn crept closer and the first faint hues of morning touched the sky, The night watch would pass the duty along. The camp would slowly stir back to life. Voices rising, wagons creaking, animals snorting. The trail called again, and we answered, ready to face whatever the new day would bring.